This was what Pol Pot then celebrated within a few months of this complete destruction. He said, no other revolution has been as complete and as fast as ours. And we will go down in history as the most amazing revolution. It's the same with the Musk-Trump belief that by destroying, you're starting at something new. It's so easy to destroy and it's so hard to rebuild.
It can't happen here in the United States, you might think, but it's already happening. This is the Rhyming Chaos podcast, where we interview people who have lived through or studied times of great change, when authoritarian rulers began to establish or abuse their power, or when old orders fell apart. I'm your host, Jeremy Goldkorn, coming to you from Nashville, Tennessee. Today, I am delighted to be speaking to author and journalist Elizabeth Becker. She began her career in 1973 reporting from Cambodia during the Vietnam War for the Washington Post. She covered the Vietnam War and the rise of the Khmer Rouge for the paper, and in December 1978, together with two other Westerners, interviewed Pol Pot, the genocidal leader of the Khmer Rouge. One of the other journalists with her was shot dead that night in slightly mysterious circumstances. Weeks later, the Vietnamese invaded and toppled the Khmer Rouge regime. Pol Pot went into hiding in the jungle with his Khmer Rouge and was not really seen again until his arrest for war crimes in 1997. Elizabeth went on to write When the War Was Over, a modern history of Cambodia and the Khmer Rouge. It's a superb work of history and journalism. It's been in print for 40 years and is considered a classic, and the reason she was an expert witness at the International War Crimes Tribunal of the senior Khmer Rouge leaders. Rendezvous avec Pol Pot, or in English, Meeting with Pol Pot, is a feature film based on her 1978 reporting trip from Pol Pot's Cambodia. It premiered at the Cannes Film Festival last year and will be released in the United States this year. Elizabeth is also the author of You Don't Belong Here, How Three Women Rewrote the Story of War, about three female journalists who reported on the Vietnam War, breaking barriers and taboos and blazing a trail for women in media. Modestly, Elizabeth doesn't really include herself as one of the women who rewrote the story of war and blazed a trail for female journalists, but she certainly deserves that accolade. The book won the 2022 Sperber Book Prize and Harvard's Goldsmith Book Prize, and her 2013 Overbooked, The Exploding Business of Travel and Tourism, was an Amazon Book of the Year. Elizabeth, welcome to Rhyming Chaos, and thank you so much for making the time.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's an amazing time to be on your podcast.
Well, thank you. I'm going to do something a little cheeky at the beginning and try to summarize Cambodia's history in a minute for listeners who might not be familiar with the country. So Hindu-Buddhist kingdoms grew up along the mighty Mekong River more than 1,000 years ago. In about the year 802, the King Jayavarman, I don't know if I've got the pronunciation right, the second, founded the Khmer Empire, beginning what is thought of as Cambodia's golden age, during which magnificent temples like the famous Angkor Wat were constructed. The Khmer Empire controlled much of mainland Southeast Asia for hundreds of years, supported by innovative water management systems. But the empire went into decline in the 15th century because of environmental challenges and conflicts with Thai and Vietnamese kingdoms. In 1863, the king of Cambodia sought French protection, making Cambodia a protectorate and later part of French Indochina. The colonial period preserved Cambodia from absorption by neighbors, but imposed foreign control until independence in 1953. Then the Vietnam War completely destabilized the region, and the revolutionary Maoist Khmer Rouge seized power in 1975. Elizabeth, is that about right?
More or less, Cambodians did not seek French protection. They were at gunpoint forced to seek French protection. It was not a, please come and colonize us. They were colonized at the point of a gun.
That is a rather important detail.
Yes. And the conflict with the regions was the Thai and the Vietnamese were both moving in to take more and more land from Cambodia. So that is an important aspect, you're right, when we begin to talk about the Khmer Rouge, this ancient sense of being engulfed by neighbors who want to take your land. So it's an old grievance.
So can we talk about the origins of the Khmer Rouge? How did the movement start?
Well, it's interesting because a major figure in this is King Norodom Sihanouk, who received credit, not always rightfully due, for independence of Cambodia in 1955 from the French. Remember, that's the year that we have the Geneva Accords that brought the end to French colonialism in Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia. And Cambodia is the only country of those three that remained in one piece. Otherwise, the other two were divided between communists and non-communists. And the reason was that Sihanouk had effectively, politically and not above board, worked around the independence movement, communist and non-communist, to take the accolades. The war never really ended in Vietnam. And Sihanouk wisely said, I'm not going to have any part in this. I'm going to be neutral. So from 1955 until 1970, Cambodia was not part of the war. Now, if you can imagine how hard that was to have an active war, the hottest war of all the Cold War, it was very destabilizing. So he would give, on one hand, a little help to the non-communists, another help countries, allies, the United States, and otherwise help the communists of North Vietnam. It was a balancing act. He was always considered walking on a tightrope, but he was very good because out of this alliance, he got North Vietnam and China to agree not to help the Khmer Rouge. So the Khmer Rouge, of all of the communists of those three countries, was the one that did not have support for a revolution. They became an official party in the early 60s, 1962, and quickly Pol Pot, then known as Solat Tsar, became the leader. So they were the odd communists out, and that bothered them tremendously. But as long as Sihanouk was the head of the government, democratically elected, although he controlled most of the democratic institutions, they had no chance of overthrowing the government and joining the communists of North Vietnam and Laos. So they were pretty much in the outs until a 1970 coup d'etat overthrew Sihanouk. In 1970, the United States had elected Richard Nixon president on the platform that he would end the war. And instead, he enlarged it. And the first thing he did was bomb Cambodia illegally. That set off a destabilizing movement. And it's not like Sihanouk didn't have enemies in his own country, but this really scared people. So a prince, a lawmaker, and a general led a coup d'etat that overthrew Sihanouk. And he fled to China, where he became the figurehead of a resistance that included the Khmer Rouge. So that right-wing coup d'etat was a gift to the Khmer Rouge, who finally got support from China and North Vietnam to have a war to head the government. And so they went to fight against the right-wing government that was installed with the coup in 1970. It was immediately supported by the United States. So that 1970, that coup is the beginning of the Cambodia side of the campaign of the Vietnam War. Is that confusing enough?
Yeah, I mean, it is an incredibly confusing piece of history. And so at this point, the Khmer Rouge are operating in the jungle, essentially. They're in the countryside.
Yes.
And they are building support because of American bombing. And what are the other factors that allowed them to grow during those early years?
Well, to complete the Sihanouk piece, Sihanouk goes on the radio. And remember, this is 1970, and this is main communications. Goes on the radio and tells all the people in the countryside who always supported him more than the people in the cities. People in the countryside, come with me. We're going to resist. And so he was at the beginning one of the best assets the Khmer Rouge had. On the ground, the Khmer Rouge also had the North Vietnamese army. The North Vietnamese army had been on the border area of Cambodia. And that's one of the reasons the United States started to work with the right-wing government to get the North Vietnamese to leave and go back to North Vietnam. It backfired. Instead, the North Vietnamese took over half of Cambodia, allowing the Khmer Rouge to develop their own forces and to begin political recruitment of the countryside. So you had a huge gift from Sihanouk as the political face, the North Vietnamese as the military force, and that allowed them, one, to have half of the country to work in and two, begin to build up their forces. Because when the coup happened, there was no way they, on their own, could have ever launched a resistance. There was no way that they could have had the resources to begin to organize the countryside. So that's the very particular way that the Khmer Rouge were hoisted up in a position where they could fight and start a war.
How did they go about weaponizing, legitimate grievances about foreign interference and corruption?
Oh, well, the Sihanouk regime, like most of those regimes in the region, was corrupt. And the major grievance was taxes, always in rural countryside like that. They'd have a good harvest, but their profits would be taxed away. The corrupt officials and that sort of thing. So that was the tool, the main tool. And the corruption under the new regime was far worse because they had all the American money. And that happened in Saigon, Phnom Penh, and Vientiane, the three capitals, where the United States just throws money. And who knows where it goes? Well, a lot of it went into very corrupt hands, and that was then used to squeeze peasants even more. So the grievance was there, and the Khmer Rouge had a puritanical ethic. No question they were authoritarian, but they had a puritanical ethic. They did not try to squeeze the peasants. They had a sense of fairness that they hadn't seen before. I mean, they were also creating the equivalent of a police state, but in the balance, a lot felt it was easier to be with the Khmer Rouge. Now, the bombing, the United States bombing, goes into high gear after a couple of years when it's clear that the right-wing government in Phnom Penh was not going to be able to defend itself entirely. And that's when you have both weaponizing that bombing. Think back, you're a farmer, peasant in Cambodia in 1973, 1972. You don't know what an airplane is. You probably haven't been in a car. And all of a sudden, war's on you. And it's always said to us, when we interview, fire's coming from the sky. What is it? It's hard in 2025 to imagine what it was like 50 years ago for these people. They would think of mythology, of Bruna, the magical, mystical bird was doing something. There was something wrong. The world was coming to an end. We can't imagine the fear. So they would all flee to, many fled to Phnom Penh to avoid the bombing if they didn't stay in the countryside. And in Phnom Penh, the American aid that was supposed to feed them was going to users who would then sell it on the black market. And so then you could start blaming the ethnic Chinese merchants, and you get this whole cesspool of corruption.
And that makes it very understandable how the Khmer Rouge could grow their support. How did they develop their ideology?
That's too grand a word, develop ideology. There were a handful of very smart, largely French-educated Cambodians who had been educated in Paris and came back with some very smart ideas about how to improve the countryside. They wrote wonderful theses, and several of them were invited by Sihanouk to join the government. That way he could sort of outflank them. And so it was imagined that those works, those sort of socialist, lefty, secretly communist theses would be the basis of the ideology. In fact, that did not prove to be true, but that was the way people, including me and the other reporters, were looking to those theses to say, what would the Khmer Rouge do if they won? And of course, they didn't follow them. I think even the authors of those were shocked at how they weren't followed. And two of the most popular were executed almost within a year of the revolution.
What role did Maoism play in this? Either the way Pol Pot was thinking about running Cambodia, or the interaction with the communist ideas that some of these people, the intellectuals had come back from France, brought back?
Well, there are a lot of people who spent years trying to track this. And you can go through, some of it was very much linked to the North Vietnamese, some of it Mao. You have to think back to who was supporting them, where did they get their ideas, and it's a mishmash. But yes, there's no question. And they always looked to China to be the main supporter. And in the end, that's what happened. When China took in Sihanouk and used Sihanouk to be the public face of the Khmer Rouge, that they were very much part of that. And they looked to Mao and Mao's extremism very much more than what later became Deng Xiaoping's reformists.
Can we talk about year zero, the concept of year zero? Because this is one of those areas where I feel as though there's some rhyming with the United States right now. And of course, we don't have the violence here, at least not yet, and hopefully it'll stay that way. But there seems to be this idea in the Trump administration, some of the ideas in Project 2025, some of the ideas from the tech people like Elon Musk about remaking society. There seems to be this idea that everything is wrong and we can only really fix it by burning everything down and starting anew. Can you talk about that way of thinking in Cambodia and Pol Pot's idea of year zero?
In fact, when you invited me, I thought that would be our jumping off point, that's where I would start. No country has been as radical as the Khmer Rouge, doing exactly what you said. Here they were, an army of a couple 100,000 soldiers, a couple million people in Phnom Penh alone. How were they going to control them, much less have a real revolution? They went for broke. They destroyed everything. They came into the city on the very first day, Phnom Penh, and said, everybody has to leave because the Americans are going to bomb. There's no way that the United States was going to bomb. This was 100% made up to scare the bejesus out of everybody and get them out. And they had soldiers immediately intimidating everybody. And when they closed down institutions, I mean every institution, people were forced out of hospitals, forced out of schools. Everything in the city was closed in. I mean, everything, name it, education, business, markets, houses, everybody was left. It's as if they came into, Washington, D.C., where I live, and said, everybody out, march over to Shenandoah Park, and then close down the city. So they closed down Phnom Penh for all of their regime, except for some special small groups of the elite communists. And they did that around the country. So immediately, there was no, we're going to cut down this, they closed everything so that you were left with a life with only hard labor.
No institutions left.
You think of what you spend your day doing. You have your own home, you go to the market, you buy your own food, you raise your kids, you don't have children, but you have everybody's educated some way or another. You have your banking services, you have your entertainment, music, movies, whatever. You're spiritual, so you go to the temple, you go to the church, you go to the synagogue. You have friends, so you meet up and you have a party, you have a wedding. Everything I mentioned is gone immediately, day one. This was what Pol Pot then celebrated within a few months of this complete destruction. He said, no other revolution has been as complete and as fast as ours. And we will go down in history as the most amazing revolution. It's the same with the Musk-Trump belief that by destroying, you're starting something new. It's so easy to destroy and it's so hard to rebuild. And if I can go back a little bit, Cambodia didn't need a major anything. It was not a country that lacked for food. It has one of the richest cultures of Asia. It has great intellectual capacity. It's the last place you would think that would need something extreme.
It's like America.
Yeah, exactly. You can see how upset I've been the last few weeks.
I know. I'm an immigrant. I came here because it was nice.
Yes. For my book, I interview people after the fact. But when it was happening, I couldn't believe it was happening. And that's one of the reasons I worked so hard to get that visa to go to Cambodia, because I couldn't believe it. And the Cambodians who lived through it, I still can't imagine how they did it. Because in the name of a cooperative society, the Communist Party owns and controls everything. Food comes from a cooperative kitchen. You live in this hellhole of a labor camp that they call a cooperative living. You need a permission to do anything other than to get up early, go farming, and an agricultural system that is incompetent. And that's the other thing that is a hallmark of all of this, is the amazing incompetence. In order to give the loyalist jobs, you put people who don't know what they're doing in a position. Does that sound familiar?
It sounds very familiar. The other thing that's familiar is the particular animus directed against educated people and intellectuals. Where did that come from? What's behind that? Why was that seen as something that Pol Pot and his...
It was a challenge to their authority. From the first, as the people were being shepherded out by gunpoint from the cities and forced into these labor camps, they went after the military, the people they defeated. They went after the officials, the people who had authority, and they went after the educated. Now, we heard from the refugees who managed to make it out that they killed anybody with eyeglasses. Now, that's not the case, but that was the way a lot of the people could, it was like part of a symbol. Like, it was so ghastly that they spoke almost in myths. And they went after people who were educated. You could not speak any language but Khmer. So if you were caught speaking French or Chinese even, or Vietnamese, it was all dumbing down so that it was greater control and getting rid of authority. The image that the Khmer Rouge themselves used was, they say, like you'd have a basket of fruit and you empty it and all the fruit disappears. And that's what they did to the people. They just threw the communities out. You break up community, which is very important. Teachers no longer with students. Family, they broke up the family. They broke up the Buddhist temples, Christian churches, Islamic mosques, all gone. There's no such thing as any community outside of those labor camps and outside of the party's control.
One of the things I think you do very well in your book is you humanize the history. There's a lot of detail about ordinary people and sort of personal details. Can you talk a little bit about how your interactions with people during your reporting at that time and how that helped you to understand what the country was going through?
It was more important than I realized until the reporting, but I lived there for 2 years during the war. And my degree at university is Southeast Asian Studies, so I had a background. And then when I went to Cambodia, there were very, very few of us who lived in Cambodia. Most of the reporters came occasionally or often from where they lived, which is usually Saigon, Hong Kong, or Singapore. So I lived there. I studied the language. I lived with the people, with Cambodians. And so you take it for granted too much that people would know what you're talking about. So when I wrote the book, I, believed that Americans didn't know Cambodia from India or China. I mean, they wouldn't know what a Cambodian was. So I concentrated on people who I knew before the war who survived. And so that's why, like, for instance, the banker who was one of my dearest friends who survived, he starts out the book with his quote, "It's one thing to suffer to live, it's another to suffer to die," because I knew him well. He was a lovely man. He supported the coup because he was afraid Sihanouk was pushing Cambodia into the side of the Khmer Rouge. Well, that became a fait accompli. But he's a really honest man. I couldn't believe that he survived finally. And so his story is all woven through. And then I took advantage of this awful system of the Khmer Rouge who, because they were incompetent and things were failing, they had to blame someone other than themselves. So they falsely accused people of doing things they hadn't done. Does that sound familiar? And then they dragged them in to Tuol Sleng and other small torture centers around the country, beat them, tortured them to sign confessions, and then murdered them and executed them. And in the process, the people believe that if they tell the truth and tell who they are and what they really did, they would be forgiven. So you have to read through these things, which is very disheartening, despairing. But I wanted to find some people who would be like people I'd known during the war. And that's why I wanted to, exactly like you said, I wanted people to feel what these Cambodians went through. And so Bopana is one, and she was later made into a movie by Ritti Pan, who made the other movie that you just mentioned, Meeting with Pol Pot. And she became something of a heroine, a hero of the country. And that's the only way, as a reporter and a writer, I knew that I could get people to feel and understand how the country slid into what it slid into and the incredible price people and the whole country paid. And if you can't stop that slide, The price is horrible. And Cambodia, in many respects, has not recovered.
Related to that, one of the things I found in the book, and I think some of your other writing and things I've read about your interview with Pol Pot. So you went with two other Westerners, a journalist named Richard Dudman and an academic named Malcolm Caldwell, and he was the one that was murdered that night after the interview. Caldwell seems to have been, I think today we'd probably call him a tankie. He was a supporter of North Korea and extremist ideology.
What did you call him?
A tankie.
I don't know that word.
I think it comes originally from communists who, after the Soviet Union took tanks into Hungary to suppress opposition, continued to support the Soviet Union. But today people use it online to refer to, often Americans who support North Korea or, any anti-American regime of any kind. The other one was Richard Dudman, who was a journalist. And it seems that he didn't really believe until much later, many years later, that there were atrocities going on in Cambodia. Is that right?
Yes. And that speaks to what happens when they take over, because there's no media. It's all propaganda. The government controlled everything that was written or heard. And when they invited the three of us into Cambodia, we saw nothing they didn't want us to see. We talked to no one they didn't want us to talk to. We were escorted with armed guards around the country, taken someplace where it was all a Potemkin village, and we were supposed to see these happy villagers eating 3 meals a day and building dams and horrible, and very young children working in factories because this is proper communist education, on and on and on. And Malcolm Caldwell, in a sense, he said, well, yeah, they're putting on a show, but the revolution was necessary. Richard Dudman wrote what he had seen and wrote what he had heard. To me, that's stenography. That's not reporting.
Right.
And I would sneak out and go looking around at what they were hiding. And they discovered I was doing that. So they locked us all in wherever we were. So we couldn't even walk around on our own. It's hard for someone to imagine what that is like, but it was all lies. And that's all we heard. But I had lived there before and I could understand a little Khmer and I connected dots. So I wrote, I believe the refugees, I believe that they have turned, everything was closed. I mean, they had turned this into, I didn't use the word concentration camp, but how could I not see this as gross human rights violations? Did I see anybody executed and tortured? No. But I saw that there were no people who had ever lived in Phnom Penh. They wouldn't show us anybody that way. I kept asking. In fact, they were convinced I was a CIA agent. They could not show me anybody who had been educated until they finally brought someone out who was emaciated and was clearly brought out to keep me quiet. But so I wrote the opposite. And we had even though we had had the same trips, seeing the same thing, we wrote 2 very different articles.
And you knew what Cambodia was like before the Khmer Rouge. You knew the vitality of the people. And then I think you write about how Phnom Penh was, completely dead. There was nothing. So you could feel that there was something very wrong.
Right. And not accept it as normal, whereas the other 2 accepted it as, okay, this must be the new normal. And that's the other thing. Do not accept new normals. No new normals. When you know that your rights are being taken away, that's not normal.
And that's what I'm finding quite frightening about the current moments in the United States is sometimes I feel like I'm a crazy person doing this podcast, talking to you about genocide in Cambodia. But I feel as though, we don't have a genocide. Obviously, we don't have the violence yet, but it's not normal what's happening. And a lot of people are just pretending it is, or even celebrating what's going on.
I don't know how many are celebrating, but silence is deafening. And it reminds me of during the war when my friends like the banker Macon Pope were very worried. And I would take their concerns to the U.S. Embassy and I'd say, okay, this war would not be going on without your support. Why aren't you doing more to tell the right-wing regime to stop what they're doing so that the people could support them and then they could fight against the Khmer Rouge? And the silence all around is what's scary, is that it's too easy to accept because it's scary to step out of your comfort zone. And even at the very end, when I decided that whichever side won, it would not be good. That's a hard thing to write, but that's what I wrote. And I told my family that if I didn't leave, I'd be either in a straitjacket or a body bag. It was so awful. And yet, my Cambodian friends, when I asked them, are you going to stay? Are you going to go? My friends were the lead that they could have left. And they said, oh, no, 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 no. The Khmer Rouge are Cambodians, so it'll work out in the end.
Right. Yeah.
Don't forget that.
Yeah, I know.
Anyway, but to finish off the Pol Pot story, so we were there and Dick and I didn't agree. But anyway, so it was a very long 2 weeks. And on the very last day, we were given 1 hour to prepare for an interview with Pol Pot. So we were the first and the last to interview him while he was in power. And it was a very set piece where he's wonderfully groomed, beautiful suit. He was supposed to answer our questions that we'd handed in. He did not. Instead, he wanted to deliver a message to the United States and the world that he knew the Vietnamese were going to invade. And that's because he had started the war. He had started a border war in order to take attention away from the incompetency of his own regime, the cruelty. And again, the use of distraction can be deadly. So he was using that distraction of the Vietnam threat of a war in order to unite the people who were, obviously dying under his rule. And so he told us that he expected that the Vietnamese wouldn't be able to win on their own, so that the Soviet Union would send troops in, and as well as troops from the Warsaw Pact, the Eastern European countries. And so he expected NATO, the United States and Western Europe, to send troops to help him, which was insane. And when the interpreter said Warsaw Pact, I turned to Dick Dudman. I said, did he just say Warsaw Pact? And then it was beyond delusional. Well, within a week after, and then that night, we were attacked in our guest house. And as the only woman, I was on the ground floor and above were the two men. The assailant first pointed at me and I ran into my room. And then he went upstairs and fired at the bottom of Dick Dudman's bedroom door, and Dick stayed in his bedroom, and then went in specifically, opened the door and killed Malcolm Caldwell, the most sympathetic. And many theories. They blamed the Vietnamese, but I saw the assailant and he was Cambodian as Cambodian could be. My sense is that they wanted to send a message to pay attention to this, and that they killed Dudman. He wasn't a journalist. He wasn't American. I don't know, but it's an example.
All right, they killed Caldwell, right?
Caldwell. Thank you. It's of a piece of how do you these are demented people. The more you destroy, the more people you hurt, the crueler you become. Why would I expect a rational reason for that? I mean, the poor Cambodians had lived under this for 4 years.
Right. Nobody was thinking normally.
To borrow from good old Buddhism, there is such a thing as karma, and it was building up, and it's awful. It's really, really awful.
How do you feel about the Cambodians who, like frogs in, slowly boiling water, lived with the changes under Pol Pot? I mean, how quickly did societal norms around acceptable political behavior change? Oh, and how much of it was simply oppression and how much of it was sort of participation by the people themselves?
It was all oppression. I mean, this is war. So this country is so weakened from war already. For massive bombing. The 1973 bombing that I covered, it's historic how massive it was. Then the degradation of the city from all of the people coming in from the countryside. Then the departure of the Americans, which just completely blew the minds of the leaders who had trusted the Americans. Famous letter, the prince who wrote to the Americans, the only thing that I regret in my life is I ever believed in you. And I thought of that letter when the United States just told Europe to go off. I mean, just his name was
Ukraine.
Yeah, Ukraine. Prince Sirik Matak. And if you want to look it up, it's just those of us who lived through Cambodia, the first thing we thought of was Prince Sirik Matak, who wrote the letter. My one regret is I believed in you. So the Cambodians were not complicit in that. They were forced at gunpoint all over the country. This is a country that's in the countryside was almost medieval circumstances. City was very destitute. They're bombing. There was nothing to bomb. They'd run out of bombing. So that doesn't work because that whole frog water stuff doesn't work. They were traumatized. They were kept that way, and they were hoping that things would improve. But every time they tried to move, people were killed. There was no compunction. People were killed. They were arrested. Families were pulled apart. So children were taken away from their parents. There were children brigades. People were forced into marriages. So this was full-bore dictatorship.
So this is rather different from, for example, the Cultural Revolution in China, or maybe what's going on in the United States right now, where you do have large sections of the population that are complicit in the atrocities.
Well, okay, put it that way. I thought you were talking about the average citizen, but within the party, yes. Within the party, the cadre, as they're called, largely countryside, not from the cities. The cadre did become soldiers of death. They had no compunction about working for them because that was the road to power. That was the road to having real food. If you wanted to survive, you could become a cadre and start enforcing the rule. Complicit, yes, they were totally complicit, but that was...
But they were part of the machinery.
Yes, they were part of the machinery.
I mean, that's different, said the United States, where you have even quite decent people supporting horrible policies.
Yeah,
right?
No, this is much more like Cultural Revolution, where Mao says, go out, we have to rev up the revolution again, and sends the young cadre to enforce sending professors out in the countryside and all that. And there's lots of books on that.
Elizabeth, you experienced some really terrifying things. And I think it's in your book, but it may have been in interviews that I've seen you do. You talk about nightmares. How did you process what you went through?
Well, in those days, it wasn't normal that journalists were considered to have nightmares and things. That wasn't acknowledged until later. And, war correspondents, I can't think of anybody from the Vietnam era who ever said that they had PTSD or anything like that. So
these are new words.
They're totally new words, and we had no training, nothing like that. But I think since I'm female, I went to a therapist. I don't know if the men ever did, but I certainly went to a therapist myself. And writing the book was very important to me because it put what I went through into context and explained how this came about. And that's very helpful when you understand what went on. And that's why, even though it's not fun, I'm trying now to keep up with all the news and do what I can, because it might be scary what's going on, but if you don't pay attention, you lose your country. And the other thing that happened is that I became a mother, and that changed me tremendously. And now I'm a grandmother, and that gives you... And I've always been a woman of faith.
So you've had family and you've had faith that have helped keep your feet on the ground and anchor you.
Yeah, get out of yourself and see yourself part of a community and things. So, yeah.
Yeah,
all of
children definitely do that.
Does it work always? No, of course not, but there you are.
Right. And so tell me what it's like living in Washington, D.C. right now.
On January 6th, I lived just a few blocks from the Capitol. So when the attempt to take over Congress happened, my husband and I were just sitting in... We had to watch on TV what's going on. And then the police built a barricade right in front of our house with police cars. And being nosy, rosy journalist, I opened up the door and said, what's going on? He said, get right back in. We can't answer questions. And we later learned that across the street and down half a block, in that alley was where one of the little bombs were placed that never went off. And then, of course, our whole neighborhood became like an armed case with fences. We couldn't move here. We couldn't move there. The National Guards were there. It was an armed camp. So you can imagine how I feel with the pardoning of all January 6th and the pretending it was a tourism event. These lies keep building up and building up. And I'm hardly the only former or current foreign war correspondent who says, gosh, this is too familiar. In fact, I wrote that in a piece last year for the Washington Post about just general fear of what would happen if built around a former congressman, but that, this is way too familiar. So no, it's not comfortable. And there's part of me that wishes I could just disappear away. I'm from Seattle and I'd love to go to Canada. I'm not going.
Our new enemy.
Yeah, but the thing is that the new administration, the Trump-Musk administration, inherited an incredibly good economy.
Yeah.
Good neighbors, good alliances, and now they're making up lies about it all to create economic insecurities, to create insecurities about who's your friend and who isn't. And those are all hallmarks. I'm worried that, one, that we're not going to have an election. The Democratic Party is all moving towards let's win back the House. And that makes sense, but I don't know if that normalcy is still with us. And unfortunately, I'm really worried about violence. I mean, that's the ingredient that's in all the others. I mean, Cambodia was already at war, but you look at anything and the threat of violence, and the violence now is online, of going after people, judges now threatening lawsuits, showing up and to harass people with their guns because the gun laws allow it. So it's in the air, and how will it manifest itself? I don't know, but that's something I'm really frightened about.
Me too. There are a lot of guns in this country.
There are a lot of guns in this country, and this administration does not believe in gun control and encourages the worst of the antagonisms and divisions. So none of that speaks well. None of that speaks well for where we are and where we might be headed.
So, Elizabeth, let me ask you a final question then. What would your advice be to Americans right now? Like, how do we stop this machine?
That you try everything. There's no magic. Don't look for a magic bullet. Support the Democratic Party if you want. Support the politician if you want. You have to be on the street, because if you're not on the street, you can be ignored. Don't give in before you have to. Support all those things in your community that you already know and trust. Right now, here on Capitol Hill, my gosh, so many of our neighbors have lost their jobs. All the money that used to go in to help the homeless and the displaced and the refugees has been taken away. Don't feel guilty that you can't answer. None of us have the answers, but contribute what you can without feeling guilty. And I'm going to keep saying, don't feel guilty, because I always feel guilty.
Are you Catholic, Elizabeth?
Episcopalian.
Oh, okay. So guilt isn't part of the deal with that.
But, Bishop Marianne, who gave that, she's our bishop.
Ah, yes. Right, of course.
Yes, Bishop Marianne.
The conscience of the nation. Yeah.
Yes, and she's very big on that. Hope is a discipline. Stay in community. Keep helping the people who need help. And we have regular demonstrations here, peaceful demonstrations. And I see demonstrations building up around the country. Your voice has to be heard. And social media, whatever you want to do. But the last thing you want to do is give up. The last thing you want to do is be quiet. And the last thing you want to do is be silent and make allies. I'm not going to go into whether or not you talk to who you talk to and when, but make allies who believe it's generally, it still kills me that the Republicans are called the law and order party when all they're doing is destroying every law and every order. And that the Democrats are, in fact, the law and order party, even if they are not unified. There's a regular, right here on Capitol Hill's, the regular demonstration in front of Heritage Foundation, which is just by the train station, Union Station. So it's all around us. And I don't know if the rest of the country understands it. I have a theory that the grocery prices, forget that. That's an argument that's long gone. But I think they're going to start understanding when they start thinking that they can take a nice vacation and get away from it, and they're not going to be able to.
Yeah.
The national parks are not going to be there for them. Try going overseas. Canadians are not going to be happy with you. Mexicans are not going to be happy with you. Europeans are not going to be happy with you. Where are you going? The walls are coming in. I'm not being very optimistic, but...
No, I think you're just being realistic. I mean, the other thing I guess I'm wondering about is at what point we will actually start to feel the decline of basic services like the post, garbage collection, people not getting their social security checks. Because I cannot believe you can have this level of sort of destruction of government without having effects. And they might take a few weeks or a few months for it to actually happen. But I think maybe that will start making it real for some people.
Yeah, I think you're right. You're absolutely right. I don't know. See, it already affects us because we have so much of the federal workforce here. But the rest of the country, you're right. With us, because it's local governments that are responsible for those kinds of services, I don't have the answer for that. I don't know how it's going to work. What's going to happen with FEMA when there's the next, we're in hurricane season, I don't know how soon. And all those different services are going to be tested. And what's going to be the response? Again, I think incompetence is always a part of these kinds of authoritarian, dictatorial kinds of grabs where you destroy, and you don't have an alternative. And I don't see an alternative. I don't think they have it. There's nothing resembling an economic policy national security. My goodness, what in the world are they doing? This latest thing of a golden dome, it's insane. They're spending that money on that where they're going to be cutting all these people's lifelines. I agree with you. I don't know. That is definitely a point. And then what happens? We'll see.
On that note, Elizabeth Becker, what a delight to speak to you, even if about very sad and terrible things. Thank you so much for coming on this podcast.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. Thank you.
The Rhyming Chaos podcast is produced by me, Jeremy Goldkorn, and edited by Cadra Scripts. The theme music is Eric Satie's Gymnopédie No. 1, arranged and performed by Wu Fei. Our cover art is by Li Yunfei. Please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, leave us a review, and if you like what we're doing, please take out a paid subscription at rhymingchaos.com.